Hello again, I am Dean Gerdeman from AIR, and I will guide you through this fourth step video module on data and measurement in the confirm phase. By now you have discovered, or are well on your way toward discovering, a few promising practices to test in the confirm phase. The goal of the confirm phase is to determine whether practices that appeared promising from the prior discover phase can really help address your team's challenges in measurable and meaningful ways. Through the confirm phase, you will learn and apply a collaborative method to build your own evidence on the extent to which these promising instructional practices may result in student learning gains. To achieve this goal, careful planning for data and measurement is essential. We suggest organizing the confirm phase around a set of 6 milestones. This module provides guidance related to several of these milestones, focusing primarily on the first 2 milestones to help set the stage for data and measurement in the confirm phase. The first milestone I mentioned was to select multiple student outcome measures for testing the promising practices identified in the discover phase. To achieve this milestone, we recommend you begin by sketching a logic model or causal diagram for each of the practices you want to confirm. Researchers often do this to make assumptions about their hypotheses clear and to help ensure that the measures they use are relevant and sensitive. This sketch can be very simple. You can start by writing a brief description of the practice in a box on the left side of a piece of paper or electronic document. Then draw an arrow to a second box that includes specifically how you think students should respond to the practice immediately or in real time in the classroom. Each promising practice might hypothetically provoke a different kind of response from students, or perhaps have a different desired response. Then draw an arrow to a third box on the right with desired student outcomes that may come to fruition later. Be as specific as possible. For example, progress toward mastery of a particular component of a standard, or progress toward the aim you documented in your challenge name statement. You may also want to include some intermediate outcomes, as well as any conditions that you hypothesize may need to be in place for the practice to have the desired outcomes. Once you've articulated how you think a practice would support student outcomes and under what classroom conditions, you will need to decide how to measure the most important outcomes and conditions. I suggest pausing here for your team to draw and discuss a working causal diagram for a promising practice you have identified. Once you have articulated the student outcomes your team expects from each practice and noted whether particular classroom conditions should be in place, your team will determine how to measure each of these outcomes. For measuring immediate student responses, you could select options such as observing and quantifying student engagement in the lesson using a protocol or a tally sheet, checking for understanding during the practice, giving a short exit quiz or assignment immediately after using the practice, checking student work produced in conjunction with the practice, or other formative assessment techniques familiar to your team. For immediate or longer-term outcomes, you might use assessments such as end-of-unit or end-of-chapter tests, student portfolio scored with a rubric, or district benchmark assessments. You should incorporate the relevant student outcome measures used in the seek and discover phases, especially measures directly linked to your team's aim. I suggest pausing the video again at this point to discuss the kinds of student outcome measures you have or may need to create for each of the outcomes listed in your causal diagrams. Another milestone in the confirm phase is to agree on sound plans and processes to test the promising practices and update the data and measurement plan accordingly to reflect your team's decisions. Accomplishing this milestone requires that your team work together to design a test of your promising practices using a few guidelines that I'll share in a moment. These guidelines were developed to do 2 things. 1, the guidelines should help you obtain sufficient evidence on whether your discovered practices could qualify as exceptional practices according to your criteria. As a reminder, an exceptional practice as conceptualized by STEP is one that makes a meaningful difference for students above and beyond typical practice according to the criteria established by STEP teams. 2, the guidelines should help you anticipate and reduce threats to the validity of your findings and increase the confidence that you may have in the findings. A first guideline for data and measurement planning in the confirm phase is to Design an approach in which each practice is tested in at least 2 rounds, each round with multiple teachers using the practice multiple times during a similar time frame. Having multiple teachers test the practice repeatedly will help reduce the likelihood that any results are due to chance. Also, having teachers test each practice roughly simultaneously will help reduce the likelihood of results being confounded by factors related to the passage of time. Exactly how many teachers should implement each practice, how often, and over how many weeks depends on the nature of the practice, what measures are available, when the team would expect to see results, and what scheduling constraints exist. Generally speaking, teams should plan to spend at least 6 weeks testing each practice. The STEP team should carry out at least 2 cycles of testing, in which a cycle includes teachers implementing the practice multiple times according to a schedule and examining and discussing the data. A second guideline: include more than one outcome measure so that you can collect data on different aspects or levels of student skills, with at least one of these measures being a summative assessment of student skills or performance. As noted earlier, there are multiple outcomes teachers may expect from using a promising practice, and ideally your team will measure outcomes in more than one way. If results are consistent across measures, then your team will have more confidence in the evidence obtained. If the results are inconsistent, then it would be time to ask more questions and perhaps collect more data. A third guideline: incorporate comparisons through measuring changes over time or across groups of students in each round of testing. Incorporating comparisons will help your team rule out other explanations for findings. I will highlight options for designing comparisons in a moment, but first I want to highlight the 3 remaining design guidelines. A fourth guideline: consider in advance what types of results and level of evidence your team would need to be confident a tested practice is exceptional. Discuss the level of outcomes you would expect for a promising practice to be considered exceptional by your team. This difference could be in terms of a percentage difference or other statistical measure, which your data support personnel can help you with. You can consider this your team's expected threshold of evidence to reference when subsequently reviewing findings from the testing of practices. A fifth guideline: include mechanisms to track implementation of the practice by teachers and the classroom conditions in which the practices take place. Throughout the confirm phase, you'll need a way to track how and when the participating teachers are implementing the practice and under what conditions. This is important to help you understand the results your team is observing. If there are differences in how teachers are using the practice, then that may explain differences in the results. Useful tools for tracking implementation and classroom conditions include the following: an implementation schedule that maps out when practices will be tested by which teachers and with which classrooms or groups of students; plan, do, study, act templates for teachers implementing the practice; or practice tally sheets for teachers implementing the practice. And last but not least, the 6th guideline: record your plans in your team's data and measurement plan and keep it updated as you go. Document any key changes you make to the plan over time. The data and measurement plan is intended to serve as the plan and record for all measurement tasks in STEP. Carefully recording and updating your plans for how you will test practices and track your work are all necessary to assist the team through navigating the many data and measurement tasks in the confirm phase. We have developed some example confirm cases to illustrate how STEP teams might incorporate these 6 guidelines to test a promising practice. I suggest pausing the video to consider the strengths and weaknesses of the case examples and begin to think about approaches your team might use in confirm. In reviewing case examples, hopefully you noted how comparisons were incorporated in the examples. Designing a comparison is an important aspect in the data and measurement plan. 2 broad options for creating a comparison that may work for your STEP team include comparisons over time and comparisons across student groups. Your team could choose to compare differences in outcomes over time, in which time provides the basis for the comparison. For example, you could collect pre-test data before starting to implement the new practice, then assess students again at one or more points along the way to see how their performance changes after having been exposed to the practice. If you have access to historic student outcome measures that are relevant to the practices you are measuring, you could also examine trends in outcomes and whether these have changed. Your team could choose to compare differences in outcomes for students exposed or not exposed to the practice. There are various approaches to this type of comparison. For example, Individual teachers could implement the practice only in some classrooms or sections and use other similar classrooms or sections as comparisons. Pairs or groups of teachers could be randomly assigned to implement or not implement the practice. Some teachers could be randomly assigned to implement one practice, while another group of teachers implements a second practice. Finally, you might compare differences among students with varying levels of exposure to the practice. You can compare outcomes for students who were exposed to the practice just once, or a few times versus many times. Each approach has its strengths and limitations. Your coach might want to pause the video now so that you can discuss comparison group approaches that make the most sense for your team's test of the practices. In the remainder of the video module, I'll provide some general advice on implementing your plan as related to other milestones in the confirm phase. Supplemental resources will be available to support STEP coaches and teams in reaching these milestones. When you have a complete data and measurement plan, you will be ready to make progress toward the confirm phase milestone of implementing the promising practices among teachers and collecting data on practices and outcomes. In short, after you've agreed on a plan, you will get to work. Here's a checklist of things your team should establish before you start testing. Be sure that every teacher testing a practice fully understands the practice and how to implement it with his or her students. Be sure that everyone knows how to use the tracking tools and outcome measures that will provide the data. Be sure that everyone has agreed to and is committed to the process for collecting, documenting, and analyzing the data. And once you start, don't forget to keep recording what you observe and discuss. Having effective documentation throughout the process will aid your efforts to review and make sense of the information you are collecting. Perhaps the most important milestone in the confirm phase is to analyze and discuss data at key points in the process and determine whether there is sufficient evidence of exceptional practice that meets or exceeds the threshold set by your team. All along in STEP, you have been analyzing and discussing data. In the confirm phase, you will engage more deeply with data, using several techniques to analyze and visualize data and weigh the evidence against your expectations and thresholds for exceptional practice. You may find that evidence does not support your hypotheses about particular promising practices, or you may not have sufficient evidence of student outcomes above and beyond typical practice to be confident in making conclusions. It will be common for STEP teams to refine measures or testing approaches, engage in the confirm process multiple times, or return to the discover phase in the search for other practices to test. If your team is confident you have evidence of an exceptional practice, you will turn to a final milestone in confirm. Describe the evidence, essential aspects, and necessary conditions for tested practices in preparation for the share phase. In preparation for share, be sure to describe the essential aspects of the practice in writing and with video or other means so that colleagues not on the STEP team can understand and implement the practices in their own classrooms, and document your methods and the evidence that led you to determine the practice is exceptional and worth trying in different classroom contexts. Best of luck as you work and learn together in the confirm phase.